Git configuration. Before talking about what Git configuration is and what exactly are we going to do under Git configuration, I'm going to talk about the reality that happens. Basically, the repositories or the projects would be placed in a place called GitHub. It can be either GitHub, GitLab or Bitbucket, any kind of hosting service which will basically have the repositories placed, and we get those repositories into our local system using a tool called Git Bash. So as we installed Git Bash earlier in our local system, we can use Git Bash to get the projects which are hosted in GitHub, GitLab or any other hosting service. Now we do get the project from GitHub to Git, and then we do our own task, and then finally we push it back to GitHub. So this is what actually happens in any company. Now this is all fine, but when you are assigned with a project, it's not the only you who is going to work on that project. It's going to be a teamwork. Everyone in the team is going to get the project from the GitHub. They are going to work on their own individual modules, and finally they will push it back to GitHub. Now for example, some other person in your team wants to know about the changes that are happened recently. For example, person A, consider he is person A and he is person B and then he is person C. Now for example, person A has completed his own task and then he pushed it to GitHub. Now how did person B will get to know that the push was made by person A? There should be some kind of identification to person A, right? So that whenever person A does a commit or does a push, person B will get to know that yes, the push was done by person A. So basically whenever you does a push, along with that push you will have some kind of identification added to that. But how does your push will have that identification? Push will get that identification from the commit. Then what do you mean by a commit, and how does your commit will have your identification? That's what we are going to do now. A commit will have the identification details that we set in a Git configuration. So Git configuration is nothing but setting up identities. So what kind of identities we set and where do we set that identification? Yes, to set the identification, the first thing that you should have is Git Bash installed on your local system, and at the same time you should have an account created for GitHub. So if you don't have Git Bash installed on your local system, you can always watch our previous tutorials to get Git installed in your local system, and similarly get GitHub account created for you. Now let me open Git Bash. To open Git Bash, I have pressed Windows button on my system. Now I'm going to type Git Bash. So whenever you type Git Bash, and if you have Git Bash already installed on your system, it is going to open up something like this, and I'm going to press on enter. Now this is called Git Bash. Okay, the first thing that I am going to check is the version which I am using. Git space minus minus version. So I am using a version called 2.27.0, and it might be different in your case. Okay, and at any time if you would like to clear the console output, for example, whenever you had given Git version, it has given you some output, and if you would like to clear this kind of output, you just have to say clear. So clear is basically used to clear the output, or you can say remove the output. So I'm going to give a press. Okay, now we need to set up the identification details. So what kind of identification details will set? Yes, the email ID which we have used to create a GitHub account, we will use the same email ID to set up the identification details, because we will basically get the project from the GitHub. That's why we need to basically use the same email ID which we have used to create the GitHub account. But before setting up the configuration, I am going to talk about the configuration variables in Git Bash. There are different kinds of configuration variables, say it be a global variable, system variable, or a local variable. So there are different kinds of configuration variables set in Git. But here in this tutorial, we are going to look at only global configuration variables, because global configuration variables are the variables which are related to a user. And if you look at here, all the variables which are global would be placed in a file called .gitconfig, which is under home directory. Here the caret symbol says we are under home directory, and the .gitconfig file is placed under home directory. That means whenever you set any kind of global variables, those variables would be placed under a file called .gitconfig. Okay, let us open this file .gitconfig and let's check what kind of variables are already present in .gitconfig file, which are basically the global variables. So I am going to open git bash. So at any time if you would like to open any kind of file, you have to use an editor called vi. So vi is a default editor which will be shipped with git. Okay, I'm going to say vi followed by dot git config. Because we are under home directory, we could able to open this file. I'm going to press on enter. Now if you look at here, this is git config file, but we don't have any data here because we didn't set up any global kind of variable so far. So I'm going to set up some kind of global variables, and I would basically come here and will check whether the data will be added here or not. So for now I'm going to go back. To go back at any time, you just have to say shift colon followed by q. Q is basically stands for quit, and I'm going to press enter. Now you are out of the vi editor. Now at any time if you would like to check all the configuration variables, which may be global variables, system variables, or local variables, you just have to say git config followed by list. It is going to list up all the configuration variables. Then you might wonder, what is this git config? Yes, git config is a tool which will come along with the git, which is used to work with all the configuration variables. For example, if you would like to set global configuration variables, you just have to say git config followed by dash dash global. I'm going to talk about that in some time. But for now, let's check all the different configuration variables which were already set. So I am going to press enter now. It is going to list up all the configuration variables. If you look at here, these are all the variables which were already set, which were not set by us, but they were already set. Okay, as I said now, git config is a tool used to set the configuration variables. And as I said earlier, global variables are related to a user. And here, since we need to set up the identification, we should work with global variables. To set global variables at any time, you can always open .git config file in the home directory, and you can manually add. But instead of doing that manually is not a good practice. So we will use the tool called git config to do the task. So I'm going to say git. Okay, I'm just going to clear it once. Clear git config followed by global. So here we are telling git config tool that we are going to add global level variables. So that's why you have to say git config followed by global. If you would like to add system variables, you just have to say git config followed by system. But for now we are not looking at system and local variables. Instead we are looking at the global variables. I'm going to say git config dash dash global followed by user dot name, because we are providing identification details here, and the first identification detail is we are setting up your name. So user dot name followed by, you can say, Ramu. Okay, since we are setting up the details for Ramu, I am going to give Ramu. If you want to set up for your own details, you could give your own name. So I am going to press enter. Okay, now we had set up name. Now at the same time we should set up email ID, which we have used to set up GitHub account. Okay, so I'm going to say global followed by user dot email, and then double quotes I'm going to say ramutoni22@gmail.com. Remember, this is the note point. You should use the same email ID which you have used to create GitHub account. If you don't have GitHub account already created, you can watch our previous tutorials to get one GitHub account created for you. Okay, I'm going to press enter. Now we had set up identification details. Now if you give git config followed by dash dash list. Now you can check here user dot name Ramu, user dot email ramutoni22@gmail.com. So what we have done so far, we had set up git configuration, we had set up an identification details, and let's talk about the importance of doing it. Okay, this is used to get all the different configuration variables, and git config is basically a tool. Okay, this is what we had done. Setting up the identity, we had used git config followed by global user.name and then user.email. Okay, before that I am going to talk about the importance of setting up this. As I said earlier, now Ramu had set up his identification details in git bash. Now whenever Ramu is going to do some commits, or whenever he is going to do some kind of push, along with his commit and along with his push, whatever the identification details he had set, those details would be sent to GitHub, so that Deepak will get to know that the push or the commit was made by Ramu.